Good morning and a very warm welcome to EPC Update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, delighted to welcome Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the European Policy Centre, and Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive, for this very special edition of Update, organised at short notice, because we wanted to discuss today Putin's war of aggression and the EU's response, a watershed moment, with a particular focus on the informal summit that is still underway in Versailles. We have some developments already emerged. We also know the broad parameters of what they're talking about this morning. So we're going to attempt to analyse for you live what the significance of all of this is. As always, totally interactive questions from me, and I hope later from all of you as we consider where we are in terms of the EU's response at this pivotal, decisive moment for Europe and the world, and what conclusions we can draw out of the discussions going on in Versailles. Your microphones are muted at the moment. If you want to take the floor, please click on the raise hands button and I'll ask you to unmute your microphone when the time comes. If you want to write your question, please use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be as brief as possible. So, gentlemen, before we start analysing in detail some of the issues that EU leaders are discussing in Versailles, I just wanted to get your overall sense of where we are at this stage. I mean, we have seen an utterly remarkable display, frankly, of European unity and resolve that many people would have said a few weeks ago was impossible. Fabian, for you, just how much of a watershed moment is this? I mean, how different is the European Union now than it was before the war began? And will it ever be the same again as it was?
Thanks, Jacki. Yes, we've seen many extraordinary things over the last 2 weeks, and it's hard to emphasize how quick this has been. I mean, 2 weeks is nothing in the framework of European policy, but we have seen momentous changes within those 2 weeks. But before I go into a bit more detail on that, I want to say two things which I think are very important to emphasize. One is the nature of what is happening, and that is what we have put in the title of this very deliberately, that this is a war of aggression. This is an attempt by a geopolitical bully to alter the realities on the ground, to alter borders, and to do that taking a terrible cost in terms of civilians, soldiers, both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side into account. So this is something which has to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. And I think this has also been one of the positive developments we have seen, that there has been almost unanimous condemnation. And the second statement I want to say is just how incredible the response of the Ukrainians has been, and that they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this war of aggression, and they have risen magnificently to this situation. And we have to do everything we can to also help them reduce the suffering as much as is possible at this moment in time. But yes, it is a watershed moment for European history. I don't think it's just for the European Union. This is a moment which we will look back to as one of the significant moments in European history, where things changed, and they changed irrevocably. There is no way in going back to the status quo which was there 2 weeks ago. In that moment, we have actually seen that the European Union, after a little bit of a hesitation at the beginning, but the European Union has risen to that moment in a way which, frankly, no one would have expected before this all started. The response has been far more decisive, far quicker than anyone would have thought. And it has cut across a number of different areas, some of which have been intractable in their difficulty beforehand. Just to mention something like migration, And in all of those areas, there has been action. So I think that's the first point to make is really in the last 2 weeks, we have seen a huge change also in the way we think about European Union action. And what we have seen is, in the words of another analyst, the European giant has woken. And the rest of the world has seen that actually what we've talked about for a very long time, that if only we stood together, if only we were united, we would have a very different weight in the world. We would be able to project much more our values and interests. And that is something which has happened now, and it has been recognized also around the world. So what we have seen is really a momentous change. Now, in that context, it has to be said that what we are seeing at the moment in Versailles, unfortunately, is not enough in that direction.
Let's come back on that in a moment. Yeah, thank you very much. Janis, would you share that assessment? The EU has risen to the moment. Indeed, it has shown what it can do when it is united, when it is decisive. The giant has woken and things are different and it is irrevocable. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I think in principle, I agree. We are in an enormously difficult moment. This is an issue of war and peace. There's blood which is being shed, especially everything which the Ukrainians are bearing at this present point in time is unimaginable. And if you compare it to how the EU has reacted to previous crises over the last 10 to 15 years, yes, we have been more unified, we have been more decisive, we have been faster, we have been more firm in our reaction to what is happening in Ukraine. However, having said that, I'm not sure that we have actually understood what this watershed moment means. I'm not sure that we have fully grasped what living in this new era means and what it then requires to do. There still is an appreciation that potentially things might change. We have to wait and see how things will develop. Yes, this is a horrible situation and needs to be condemned, but there still is this thinking, but we have to see how bad it is. And I think that there is still an underestimation among some, not every, among some of what actually this new era will entail. And if you look into the situation in Ukraine, and we need to be very careful with speculating about developments, we have a situation which is further escalating. The chances are that what we will be seeing from Ukraine will get worse. We have President Putin, who is, yes, I think he's pushed into the corners. He did not expect that our reaction, the West's reactions, the world's reaction would be as it has been. But being squeezed into the corners is not obviously also good news. It makes him even more unpredictable, and he cannot afford to lose. I personally think that at the end of the day, he has lost. It's just a matter of how long he will still be able to survive politically and also himself in being running his country, and the pressure on Russia, on the Russian people, the sanctions will be working, are showing its signs. But he is defending something which he has in his mind and a plan which he has made up a long time ago. So that means that what we are now experiencing is not going to leave. And the decisions we're taking now need to reflect that. They need to be decisive, and they need to be long-term. You need to prepare ourselves for what is coming. And we're doing all this under time pressure. So for all those who say, let's wait and see how the sanctions will work, let's wait and see how the situation will develop, my answer is we don't have the luxury of waiting. The Ukrainian people don't have the luxury of waiting, but we all don't have the luxury of waiting and having an attitude, let's wait and see, because it's not going to go back.
And we will, when we get into some of the detail of what's being discussed in Versailles, indeed, that is an argument that you hear posed in several areas. So we'll come back on that. But Fabian, I stopped you. You wanted to give a broad assessment, bearing in mind, of course, those Versailles talks are continuing as we speak. We've seen one statement. It's an informal council, so they're not formal conclusions, but one statement from last night's discussions. Come back on that. But Fabian, a couple of hours ago, you tweeted, this is a watershed moment, but not not necessarily in a positive way, and we must do better. Now, given what you've said about how remarkable the EU's response has been so far, in overall terms, and without going into the detail yet, why the pessimistic tone this morning? Why does one feel a sense of frustration from you now?
I'm not sure I would call it pessimistic. I think what we are seeing now is a reversion to some of the thinking patterns we had before this crisis hit us fully, where people are, as Janis was just talking about, looking to wait and see. Let's delay a bit, let's try to assess the situation. And for me, this is not a situation where you can afford to do that. But on the other hand, I also believe that developments are going to drive decisions. And you might be able to delay for a little bit. But in the end, we are going to have to address these tricky questions. And the things which are on the agenda now will have to be resolved in a different way than what appears to be coming out of the summit. As you say, it's not finished yet, and maybe leaders will come to a more decisive conclusion, but at least the indications at the moment are not that. Okay, so what we have to see, and maybe it will not happen today, maybe well, certainly it didn't happen yesterday when it came to questions of enlargement and the relationship with Ukraine the EU has. But we will see that the ground will continue to shift in the next few days. And many of the things which people are now saying, well, let's wait and see, will become a reality.
And indeed,
that really worries me, sorry, but just, and we can go in more detail, but what really worries me is that we also have to start thinking about the long-term direction of where we want to go to that and how we actually set up the systems in the right way so that we can address these challenges in a united and in a decisive way.
Okay, thank you very much. And Janis, do come in. I mean, I'm just reminded though, when you say things could change in the days after Versailles, precisely we last met when there had been a European Council decision, and there was a decision not to do anything about SWIFT, the payment system. That was changed within a day or so of our last meeting. Shows how fast things are moving. But Janis, a brief one if you would, because I want to delve into some of the detail of what's being discussed in Versailles.
Yes, you're right. Things are moving, can move. And let's not forget, we also have an ordinary European Council meeting at the end of the month. So there's also a moment from now until then to prepare and to become more concrete. But you said, rightly so, Jacki, that some of the things which we've seen have been remarkable. But I think, given that we are in this, using the term which Chancellor Scholz was using, Zeitenwende, that we are in this new era, we need to be permanently remarkable. It is about a permanent, strong political will and the political stamina to push things through. It's not about only now. This needs to be permanent. The pressure on us needs to be permanent. And I think, and I go back to analysis which we've done over the past 10, 15 years throughout all these different crises in the context of the poly crisis or the different chapters of the permanent crisis, call it whatever you may. We have been best when we have been expecting the worst to avoid the worst.
Yeah.
If we follow that motto, listen to those who now expect the worst, also among EU member states. And if you talk to people who are closer to Ukraine, they will tell you expect the worst in a different way than others are expecting. So maybe it's smart to follow them rather than follow those who say, let's wait and see. Maybe it might be not as bad as
let's get into more detail in specific areas. And I want to start with the discussion that dominated 5 hours of discussion last night on the question of Ukraine's application for immediate EU membership. And I want exceptionally to read out the conclusions in this part. First of all, many people may not have seen them yet, and then we'll discuss them. The conclusions say the European Council acknowledged the European aspirations and the European choice of Ukraine, as stated, and it points specifically to the association agreement. The Council has acted swiftly and invited the Commission to submit its opinion on this application in accordance with the relevant provisions of the treaties. Question mark, what are they referring to there? Pending this and without delay, we will further strengthen our bonds and deepen our partnership. Ukraine belongs to our European family. Very nice, strong words, Janis, but is this a classic EU fudge? What do they really mean? Are they holding out the prospect of membership, or are they very firmly not? You can read it, it seems to me, both ways.
Yes, and this is exactly what it is supposed to be, that you can read it in different ways, because you have strong divisions among the EU 27 when it comes to the perspective of giving Ukraine / also others the perspective of joining the European Union at some point in time. There are some who argue we need a fast track, we need to give a clear signal, we need to make sure that Ukraine has a clear perspective to join, and that we even, that's what some argue, need to give them even a time perspective. And others saying we should not do that because one, we will not be able to uphold that promise. We have a process which needs to follow. We also, some argue, that we should not make sure, we should make sure that we don't, and I quote, provoke Putin, provoke him more by doing something with respect to the perspectives of Ukraine coming into the European Union. So you have a strong division between member states.
And it's geographical, isn't it? Those closest to Russia tend to be in the camp that says we send a strong signal and we send it now, and those further away more in the camp that says there is a process, we need to take time, and so on. It's fairly
again
clear.
I wouldn't, there is geography which plays a role, but again, I would revert to what I said earlier. Those who expect the worst are also the ones who now want to push furthest when it comes to how we deal with Ukraine in terms of the membership question. But this text actually is not a compromise, because they were not able to compromise on a common position. It's simply finding language which they can live with, because it's sending out the signals in two different directions. To take an example, as you were quoting the text, there is no reference to Article 49, which is the article in the EU treaties with respect to enlargement. So, but there's a reference with respect to the provision of the treaties. There's no reference with respect to membership in concrete terms, but there is a reference to association agreements. So that indicates this is the paradigm in which we're operating. And I think this is, and now to make a step back, this is a mistake. Because as we were saying earlier, if this is a watershed moment, if this is a new era, we need to also think of enlargement in a different way. And we're not thinking of enlargement in terms of the process, but in terms of also the outcome in a different way. Now, enlargement in many ways is becoming a strategic question, or maybe even a strategic imperative.
Okay.
So you need to rethink how you were thinking about enlargement compared to before what happened in Ukraine, where it was more of an internal discussion which we're having among ourselves as to what it means to enlarge.
Okay, just for follow up before I bring Fabian in, you say it's a mistake, but isn't it a reflection of political reality? And if they pushed it, if those who want to move faster on this question had pushed too hard, the risk is we wouldn't have language. I've heard people say this morning, but this starts the process. So actually, it's kept the door open. If we push too hard, it might have been slammed shut. Very briefly, Janis, before I bring Fabian in.
Don't get me wrong. The fact that we had also a long and intense discussion about the question of Ukraine's perspective regarding EU entry is good. We need to have these discussions. We also need to have a frank discussion among the 27. And it's good that they have agreed on that language. But it's just showing to us, and that's what was the main argument, and it links to the general exchange we had earlier, that we actually are not reflecting how difficult and how momentous this moment is in terms of enlargement. Okay. We follow the old paradigm instead of overcoming old taboos, rethinking how the enlargement process could look like, and whether there are also alternative forms as belonging, as I and others have coined them in the past, below full membership, and think about that more creatively. And what we're doing is we are reverting, some of us are reverting to old reflexes.
Fabian, your assessment keeps the door open, gives enough positive language for those who want to see this move fast, and as we've said, therefore can be taken up and can be accelerated as if and when things develop, or as Janis is more arguing, just not enough at this stage to recognize the different world we're in.
I think it's important to start with saying that we're talking about two different issues here. One is the question of what is the best approach in terms of EU membership of Ukraine. And there are a number of issues which have to be considered there and which have to be discussed there. I think one of the things, for example, which I find is missing from the debate by and large, is the question of what does that then actually mean for Ukraine if you would put them into the European Union, including all of the economic conditions, which are actually part of that. So this is a discussion which needs to take place. And it doesn't mean there necessarily is the outcome of SWIFT membership now or whatever it might mean. But I think what Janis and I are talking about really is about the signal this is actually giving about the more general state of decision making. So what we are actually seeing there is the pre-crisis mode of constructive ambiguity. We acknowledge, we play for time, we just try not to make a decision because we don't know what the decision is. We know that there are differences between the member states. So the best thing is to delay and not to make any decision at all. And that is not possible anymore. And this is what I meant by we will see within the next few days that this cannot hold, because you cannot, in a situation like this, simply not make a decision. Whatever is going to happen, you will have to make a decision. And what this also shows is, and I hope this will change, and I hope the leadership of the European Union will rise to this moment, and I'm talking here about institutional and national member state leadership. We need leadership. We need people who make decisions and who then also engage with population. And in many cases, what we're seeing now is that populations are further than their leaders, that the populations are looking at these non-decisions and are saying, that's not good enough. You're going to have to do more. You have to do it better than what you've done up to now.
Lots more ground to cover. So Janis, a brief one on this, if you would, and then I want to move to
sorry, but yeah, no, but there is, I think we're all realists. We know how difficult the enlargement process is. We know that this process takes a very long time and also has to take a very long time, also in the interest of the country joining, by the way. And if, as many are now saying, the situation will be in Ukraine, this war won't be over soon. It might even take, some are saying, not me, I'm not a military expert, saying this might last for years. So a country which is in an active war, joining the EU will not happen. So it is about sending a signal. But then there's the other side of the coin. If there is, this has become a strategic question, and enlargement becomes a strategic imperative, not also only by the way with respect to Ukraine. This goes far beyond Ukraine. If this is true, there's the other side of the coin. And that, let's be reminded of what happened after 89-90. When we were moving towards the Big Bang enlargement 2004-2007, we ourselves had to prepare for that moment. So it's also linking, widening and then deepening the old discussion.
Okay.
So this is also about us and our readiness to reform ourselves. So having the long-term perspective in mind means also that we have to look at how we need to reform the European Union fundamentally inside in order to prepare.
Indeed. I do want to concentrate though today on some of the specifics of what's happening in Versailles and try and give our audience an analysis of where we are. I know these are issues which arouse all our passions deeply, but let us move to another area. They're discussing it this morning. We have no real readout yet, but we had quite a lot of readouts yesterday on people's way into the summit and in the days ahead. And this is the question of whether we have a recovery fund 2.0, as it were. The question of whether we again, as we did because of COVID, see another historical agreement on more joint European investments financed by joint debt. France, of course, championing this. It seems, Fabian, that although it doesn't look like there's an agreement on this yet, and we do have a sort of let's wait and see approach, that the frugals, as we like to call them, aren't necessarily adamantly or dogmatically opposed. And I want to quote Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, who said on this issue yesterday, "I am not at this stage agreeing with a next generation EU Mark II. You said," and I'm sorry to quote your tweets at you again, but you said in response to that last night, "As with many other taboos in the wake of this invasion, it will be broken within days." So where do you think we are in that discussion? you clearly think it will change, but what will be the unlocking? Because we're seeing the attitude you both arguing shouldn't happen, a sort of let's wait and see, let the dust settle before we talk about what we need to do financially, in terms of energy, in terms of defense.
I think we will see within a very short time something which resembles a recovery fund, whatever that will be called, however that will be financed. And of course, there will be still a lot of detail which will have to be worked out. I don't think we will see that decision today, because the indications we have from the summit is that there are some countries which are opposing it. But in the end, necessity will drive the decisions. In the end, we cannot just simply let the economic impact of this run wild. There will have to be a counteraction. We also know that, yes, there are very strong distributional effects. It's the same crisis, but it's very asymmetric in terms of the effects. But no country will escape from those effects, as we have seen with the COVID economic fallout, as we have seen in previous crises. So it will come. The question is just how quickly will it be done? And also, frankly, how will it look? Will it look like our leaders are drag kicking and screaming against their will? Or are they going to portray themselves as proactive, as looking at these issues from the beginning? And we will have to break new taboos. We will also have to look at some of the instruments we already have in place, like the existing Recovery and Resilience Fund. There is absolutely no way that this can only be a temporary facility. These kind of instruments now have to be a permanent part of the European armament against these kind of situations. So I think we will see that debate moving on very quickly. I think we will also have to have a very serious debate around what we do around energy prices, how we can cushion the cost of living crisis, which is going to be made even more acute. We already have had the problem beforehand. We have to have a discussion around inflation and how much inflation Europe in the current situation is willing to bear, which is a different answer than the answer was 2 weeks ago. So these are the kind of discussions which are politically difficult, but they will happen. But if we don't do this, the effect is simply going to be that, let's take my example with the energy prices, we will not maintain the unity of the European response if we are not addressing this issue. So in a very short time, unless we address this issue in the next days, we will get into a situation where we are back to the ineffective, fragmented response we had 2 weeks ago.
Fabian, Janis indicated there, it can't be short term. These will be long-term challenges. But doesn't that, I mean, those who were concerned about Recovery Fund 1.0, to use the same analogy, said, oh yeah, but we're setting a precedent. Now, so soon afterwards, but in very dramatic circumstances, we are talking about a second one, and people fearing, yeah, then there'll be a third and a fourth. We are going down this road and we won't be able to stop it. How do you see that debate evolving among the member states? And is it significant, do you think, when Mark Rutte says at this stage, rather than saying, I don't see a need, he says, I don't see a need now?
Well, first of all, to tell you,
No, Janis, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, Fabian. First of all, to tell you the truth, I couldn't care less about a discussion as to whether last time it was a Hamiltonian moment, whether now is another one, and whether it will be there forever.
But some leaders do.
I know, but where we are now is that we have something to do, which has to do with our energy policy, which is going to be very costly, which also links, by the way, to environment and climate change. Second, we need to invest a lot into defense. Third, we see that the spread of the costs of what we're doing in order to counter this war of aggression is not equal among member states. So we need to do something about that. And putting it on the shoulders of member states alone will not work. Now, the argument is, we still have enough money in the recovery fund, the Next Generation EU, so we could use that money. Sure, use that. But I would already give a prognosis that that will not be enough. And then waiting would be the wrong signal. Let's think of it now. But we're living in a situation where we have some actors led by France, but also by Italy, pushing in a certain direction. Interesting also, for example, now the Austrians have indicated more of a readiness, who have been in the frugal camp in the past, but you have the Dutch and the Germans who are very opposing. To quote Mark Rutte again, because you said, was it important that he said at this stage? He also said, if we would now put in place a recovery fund 2.0 or Next Generation 2.0, a country like the Netherlands, I'm quoting, a country like the Netherlands would spend a lot of money not on ourselves, but on others. Okay, that's the logic.
That's the whole point, though.
This is the wrong logic.
Yeah.
Okay, and in Berlin, you hear from some who have been using a word for all those who speak German, that Next Generation 2.0 is a Rohrkrepierer. It will never happen. Is that what this says? This is out of the question. It will never happen. And I think if we are at a Zeitenwende, as Chancellor Scholz said it, you cannot say it will not happen, and it should not happen. Let's think about how it can happen. Some have said, let's go for the SURE model. The SURE model is loans, is not grants. Let's think of these things constructively instead of saying, we don't need this tile, let's push it away. But you need to have an agreement between Paris and Berlin to move. But Berlin, this time around, and that is different to where we were in April, May of 2020, thinks we are going to suffer a lot from this crisis. The costs on us will be enormous, and we will struggle to cope with it. Whereas in 2020, we could cope with the effects of the pandemic, which also made them push to go towards Next Generation EU, also because they knew if they wouldn't, that would undermine the single market. So they had, out of enlightened self-interest, they had that position. Now, this is not the case.
Okay.
However, and then I'll stop with that, okay? If you ask that we need to act according to the magnitude of the challenges we have, and that I think is the right ask, that also has costs. And in Germany, they say, if we cut ourselves from Russian energy, this will cost 5% of our GDP. But some years ago, we told some countries, you need to do what needs to be done, and you need to get your act together, and they lost a fourth of their economy. So the logic, the economic logic in a situation like the one we are now experiencing is a logic which should not prevail.
Thank you, Fabian. I know you wanted to come back in, and can I link this then also to the energy question, as that is where Janis ended his thinking. At the moment, of course, because the EU is so much more dependent on Russian energy than the US, than the UK, it has not gone anywhere near as far as they have in terms of the target for phasing out imports and reducing that dependency. You've said taboos are changing everywhere. Is this another one that will change, or the economic reality that Europe can't change that fast will hold it back? What is your assessment of what's going to happen? So please do react to what Janis just said, but then your assessment of what's going to happen in the debate over energy.
I mean, I think it's very much linked to what Janis just said, that when we're talking about solidarity in this field, it is about enlightened self-interest. It is about actually something which helps the union as a whole. And just to react to the question of, will it set a precedent? Well, yes, and it should. That's exactly the point. That's the kind of thing we need in this situation. And this is a changed world where we will need these things permanently. So fighting against these kind of precedents is anachronistic. We should actually have a real consideration that this is the way forward. Now, I think it is already a positive sign that Rutte puts in this caveat, because I assess him as a very clever politician. So that already acknowledges that he knows that there might have to be a U-turn sometime very soon. So in that sense, it is a positive sign. But I think overall, people should be understanding that, and I'm now going to borrow a phrase from Angela Merkel, which we had in a different crisis, there is no alternative. There is no other way of dealing with this. And that also applies to the energy question. Because what we should be thinking about is not what will happen in the next 2 weeks. What we should be thinking about is to say, where are we going to end up at the end point of this process. And the end point of this process is the decoupling of the Russian economy from the European one.
Yep.
We will no longer import gas from Russia. Now, there is a big question now of how do we get there? How quickly has that got to be done? This will also depend on Russia, by the way. It might be that Russia enforces a much quicker decoupling, but the end point is very clear. So we will have to do it. And we should be starting now to put the things into place which recognize that reality.
Okay. Janis, quick one, then I want to move on to refugees. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate, put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand. Janis.
First of all, I think Fabian is right. These are things which have to be done. And also, if you look into the first proposals from the Commission, Repower EU, let's get used to a new term to be used. Repower EU leads in the right direction. Now, this has been put together under very much time pressure. So there's things which still have to be thought through. And they also had a discussion about that yesterday in Versailles. So that leads in the right direction. But the thing we see is that there are governments who are trying to gain time. And let's not forget, it's not only Berlin which is hesitant when it comes to how to deal with Russia and when it comes to energy. Also the Austrians, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, all those, the Italians who have a strong dependence on energy imports are now cautious. And they're cautious, why? Because they want to gain time. We are in March. We're not in October, November. The winter time is getting to its end. So gaining time, preparing yourself for the next winter, and probably the more difficult one will be the winter thereafter, but preparing yourself, gaining time to get to that moment can, and I use the quote from the German economy minister, Habeck, who said, we would lose 5% if we would now decouple ourselves energy-wise from Russia, 5% of our economy. So if you gain time, that 5 will become less. And others are thinking in similar lines.
So in this area,
but what signal is this giving?
Okay, but in this area, unlike other areas where you said we can't afford to wait, we can't afford, they almost need to. They have to because they need to gain a bit of time.
Well, it depends on what kind of signals you want to send out. And the logic which you hear among those who say, if we would now decouple ourselves from Russian energy immediately, actually, that wouldn't change the mind of Putin. That wouldn't change his reaction. That wouldn't change his actions on the ground in Ukraine. Yes, it might make it more difficult, but it won't change him. So that's their argument. So they say, if we now go in this direction, we will not change the course of actions in the immediate future. Plus, we might even make things more difficult, and that's the ones who are hopeful. If we return to a status quo, we can live with it in terms of.
We've still got lots more to discuss and not long to go. So on the next ones, I'm going to ask us to really be very tight and disciplined. I wanted to talk about refugees, first of all. There is, in the statement that was issued last night, underlining again, and I quote, continuing to show solidarity and provide humanitarian, medical and financial support to refugees. And it says in terms, we will offer temporary protection to all war refugees from Ukraine and to the countries hosting them. I mean, this has been remarkable. You talked earlier about populations sometimes moving ahead of their governments, Fabian. In this case, not only has public opinion moved ahead, but the public, it's not just governments, particularly on the border with Ukraine, who've responded in an incredible way. It's been individuals taking people into their families. I was astonished to understand that there are no refugee camps in Poland because they're all being taken in and hosted in families and so on. This is very unlike refugee crises we have seen in the past and the solidarity that's being shown. Would you expect that to be maintained? What does the EU need to do next?
I think it's coming back to what I said before on other topics. In a way, we don't have a choice. What is the alternative? We cannot send them back. Hopefully, at some point, yes, there will be the possibility for them to return to Ukraine. And I would expect that the vast majority of them will want to return if the conditions exist for that. But in the meantime, while there's a war going on, we will have to take them all. And we will have to find ways of doing that. And that also, and I think this is a very important one to emphasize, we should recognize that that not only includes Ukrainians, it includes also other nationalities which are being caught up in this process. But yes, the response on the ground has been amazing. It has been in particularly the frontline countries who have received the brunt of this. It has been both at the official level and at the population level. An enormous effort has been made and continues to be made because we are in an ongoing situation, which is absolutely positive to see. I think in part, the reason is that for many in Europe, there's a feeling that it could be us. This is no longer a distant foreign issue. This is something which is affecting the kind of people which we understand, we actually see a lot of similarities with. So I would actually expect that by and large, the solidarity will hold, but it also means we will have to think about how we actually deal with this also in the slightly longer term, in the medium term. How do we enable them to also participate in economic life, to participate in education, all of the things which are necessary to integrate them as much as possible. And I think what we also should highlight is that there are instances where the overarching framework is not translated like that when it comes to the actions on the ground. You know, with queues in front of the offices to be registered, with in part dramatic scenes where people don't know where to go. This
I'm talking more about the country you and I know best, or you half know best,
and I think this,
which is no longer an EU member.
Yes, I was going to go there because I think there are these inefficiencies. Yeah. But then there are also some countries, and you were referring to the UK there, who are at the moment not doing what they ought to be doing, and very obviously not doing what they ought to be doing. And that is frankly shameful. The UK government should be ashamed of itself that it cannot match the words it has put out there about the conflict in Ukraine with the action which is required for the Ukrainians who are fleeing. And even criticizing Ireland for taking them, I think this is a really shameful display.
I agree, and I have no words for the country I used to know best. Janis, a brief one if you would, because I want to come on to security and defence policy and the EU's position in the world as a result of all of this.
We have now more than 2 million people who have fled. International organizations are telling us that it might be up to 7 or 8 million. It might even be that they have to stay longer than 3 years, which are now covered through the temporary protection directive. So let's prepare ourselves for that in terms of the numbers and in terms of the duration, which means that you need to prepare in different ways. It is very good that the EU27 agreed very swiftly to activate the temporary protection directive, which is an old directive which had never been used, that there is money being provided to those countries and the people of the countries who have been extremely supportive to the refugees, whether it's Poland, whether it's Romania, but also Moldova, a non-EU country which needs our support. So all this is good. And I just want to quote Hugo Brady, who is an expert on migration. He was in the team of Tusk at some point, who said that this is the Wir schaffen das. Quote from Angela Merkel again, the Wir schaffen das moment for countries like, we're gonna make it. That's what she said when we were experiencing the 2015-16 migration management crisis. She said, Wir schaffen das, we're gonna make it. And he said, and correctly so, this is the Wir schaffen das moment in countries like Poland. But let's not forget, the Polish took up 1 million Ukrainian refugees after Maidan. And they were able to cope with that. And so there is a strong readiness in the member states to cope, but we need to support those who have to bear much of the burden. We need to also, in those countries where people are now arriving, prepare themselves to be able to disperse them within the country. And last but not least, we should not fall into the trap of using the current situation to try to renew the discussion about the new pact. Let's now concentrate on what's happening and see what influence that potentially might have in the longer term, but let's not connect this because we shouldn't open old wounds while we're now effectively dealing with the current situation of millions fleeing from their countries.
Absolutely, thank you. And I hope we don't have time today, but also to come back to what for me is a very interesting question about, you mentioned Poland, and of course in the front line of all of this, receiving a lot of support from the rest of the EU. What does this do in long term to relations between Poland and Hungary and the rest of the EU? Because the unity that has been shown among the 27 is one of the, people say, Putin's most remarkable achievement, to bring those countries back into the fold. Can I just take one very quick question, and really quick, from Javier Dos on, and this relates to energy prices. How is it possible, he says, that current rules governing the European electricity market, with its auction system that makes us pay the price of all types of electricity with the price of the most expensive type produced, continue to be maintained? What national and corporate interests are driving such barbarically inflationary systems? I'm not going to read all this. Why do we not use the enormous profits we've made in the past? Why are they not being used, the profits made by electricity companies, to lower prices? Is there any debate? I think the Greeks, Fabian, were talking about intervention in the market, intervention in terms of price capping of one sort or another. Do you see this discussion going anywhere at EU level? Briefly, if you would.
Sorry. Yes, I do think that we are going to have to take extraordinary measures. And this is coming back to what we've said before about taboos being broken. In the short term, and that also relates to the question of what happens if we decouple very abruptly for whatever reason, whether it's us deciding that or Putin deciding that. What that will mean is that we will have to intervene in the markets in an unprecedented way in all countries. And that does also mean that we have to make very difficult choices. I mean, I think we have to have a very open discussion at the moment about, for example, that in the next month and possibly years, we are going to burn more coal than we had planned to do, because we have to at this moment in time. It doesn't mean that we should be jeopardizing our long-term transition, and we have to start planning now of exactly how we do that. But what we are going to have to see is that we are intervening in markets, not just in the energy market. We are talking about a very different way. And in some ways, what we're talking about here is a war economy. We have to respond to this declaration of war, which Putin has made on liberal democracy. And we should never forget, this is not only Ukraine, even though Ukraine bears the brunt of it at the moment. But Putin has declared war on liberal democracy, and we have to defend ourselves.
We'll come back. Janis, we need to move on because there is one absolutely huge topic that we have not addressed yet. And I'm sure we will come back on the implications of all of this. As you were just saying, Fabian, we need to talk about the Green Deal. We need to talk about the implications for the debate on strategic autonomy and so on. All issues we'll come back to in future updates. But I did want to talk today about defense, the common defense and security policy. There are those arguing, Janis, that this is a watershed moment for that as well, that this will see a huge push to make it a reality. There are others saying this really underlines much more the focus should be on NATO, it shouldn't be on EU defense capabilities. How do you see this specifically affecting the debate on the common defense and security policy? And more broadly, I think, I can't remember which one of you said at the beginning, the EU has shown what it can do when it is united and when it gets its act together. It's shown the world it can be a real player. Do you see this changing the EU's role in the world, perceptions thereof, and its own perception of its role? Two linked questions, but I'm going to take them together because we don't have too long. Janis.
Well, first of all, when it comes to defense, we have not shown yet that we can get our act together and be united and then play a role which is commensurate to the fact that of how much we're spending on security and defense and how big this European Union is, 450 million people. So we have not lived up to that up till now. Yes, this is a watershed moment. It is, and I'm quoting again Olaf Scholz, Zeitenwende, and that's how he described it in order to transform things in Germany. Saying that they will invest 100 billion over the upcoming years. So we see that, yes, there is an agreement that this watershed moment. The question is, how will we deal with it in real terms? And that we do not know yet. The verdict is still out. We have to see what will come out of today, out of the declaration when it comes to defense from Versailles. We will see that expenditure will increase. The 2% the target is now something which everyone is adhering to, but then the question is, how do you spend that money? How do you only spend it nationally? Do you spend it at the European level? How do you coordinate things? How quickly do you do that? Because we don't have time, okay? Let's all just think a second about the current situation with Donald Trump in the White House. How much would we have been able to take the burden of what's now happening? How firm would we have been able to be also in diplomatic terms and economic terms? Because it's not about increasing military defense expenditure in order to use our militaries. It's in order to enhance our ability to have a stronger power in negotiations and dealings with certain situations. And that means we are under severe pressure, not only with respect to spending more, and that I think is also with respect to Germany important, which is a key country in this respect, but to change our strategic culture, how we deal with foreign and defense policy.
What do we? You said
this is a long-term development, which we have to do without having time. That is something which bringing that together is extremely difficult.
And just to be clear, what do we expect? You mentioned, we don't know what will come out of Versailles. What is the most we could hope for from the Versailles Declaration, and what do you expect to come out from that? Just some nice words again?
Well, I think that you will have a strong commitment to increase defense expenditure. You will hear that we need to do that also in a concerted way at the European level. So there will be strong words, also indications of the direction. The question is, how do we implement it? How do we translate that? And that, unfortunately, a past record. And I'm now going back decades, okay? Because yes, this is a war of aggression by Putin, which is a very particular situation, but we've had other wars in Europe over the past decades. Let's not forget Yugoslavia, and the Balkans. And we took some lessons at the time, but not enough. And if you go back into documents which are 20, 30 years old, they have been calling for a lot, what still needs to be done. So we have a lot to do, and the pressure, and as I repeat that, the time pressure on us is very high. So we need to change our culture, we need to spend more, and we need to do that within a rather short period of time because we are under this pressure.
Fabian, a reaction on that and to this broader question of how the EU positions itself and how it is perceived in the rest of the world as a result of the developments of the last 2 weeks and what is likely to come.
And I think firstly, it's important to emphasize that it's a good thing that finally the countries of Europe are meeting the obligations which they have committed to for far too long. And we have said that before. Have we been hiding under the US umbrella? It was a very comfortable way of going forward because we didn't have the difficult choices or having to spend money on something which a lot of the population didn't see as strictly necessary. That discussion is over now. So we are going to have the spending increases. And what we have also seen, and I think this is important also to reflect on in the longer term, is that Germany's understanding of itself as a geopolitical actor has changed. And if you see opinion polls where 80% broadly support the direction in which this is going, that is a tremendous change in the way Germany sees itself. And we will have to also find ways of ensuring that that is tied into the European system, because what we certainly don't want is Germany leading by itself. But I think when we're looking at the wider sector, we shouldn't forget that spending by itself is not the answer. Because if you add up all the spending of European countries in the area of defense and security, it's a very sizable amount. The question is, what do we get for that amount? And up to now, we have been very ineffective in terms of translating that into the capabilities which are necessary to deal with questions like we are dealing with at the moment. So that also means we have to tackle some of the difficult questions which people don't want to tackle. How do we deal with consolidation in the defense sector? How do we deal with the transatlantic relationship, with the uncertainty which Janis was referring to? How do we deal with strategic autonomy or technological sovereignty in all of those areas where we have vulnerabilities, which is particularly important in some areas of security, where we are actually behind where we should be in Europe. So there are a lot of difficult policy decisions to come to make this the real increase in capacity and capability which we need at the European level.
Thank you very much. And Janis, in terms of how the rest of the world perceives the EU as a global actor, not just in relation to what it does in this specific area, but more broadly in what we've seen the EU do over the last couple of weeks, going back to where we started today, do you think this has changed the perception of the EU as a bloc and its relevance? Or is that still an open question for you?
No, I think it is having an effect. And obviously, the outside world is looking at us and witnessing what the European Union is doing. And as we said in the beginning, some of the reactions which we've seen have been remarkable. And the unity which the EU27 have shown has been remarkable. Again, much more needs to be done. And we've been discussing this over the past hour. But this is also being seen. But then there are also these questions out there is, how much will they, in the long term, sustainably adhere to the unity which they have now found? How much of the things which they are now saying they need to be doing, are promising that they will be doing, will they actually do? So we're being looked at, we are being witnessed. And by the way, witnessed by those who are now our adversaries. Putin is looking at what we're doing. But there are also those who are have been critical with us. The Chinese are looking at what we're doing. And our old friends, the Americans, are looking at what we're doing. So how we react now will have an effect, and now meaning not now, but in terms of the context of this crisis, will have an effect on our overall positioning in the international system, in our credibility. So this is an important moment also from that perspective. And just in addition to that, there are also effects of this crisis. Look at the food prices, how they are increasing, and there will be affecting parts of this world which have already been struggling. So we also need to think of these aspects. It's not only about Europe and the global order, it's also about some consequences of this crisis.
Indeed.
On those who are suffering more from it.
And this issue of food security now beginning to come to the fore. Fabian, a final word from you in terms of this as a watershed moment for Europe's place in the world as well.
I think what we said at the beginning applies also to this. The status quo post-invasion is different from what it was before, and it will not change. We cannot go back to a situation where essentially Europe was by and large rather content to take a backseat. There will now have to be more demands on Europe. And the question is whether we will meet them in the way which is necessary. But whatever happens, the role of Europe in the world has changed. And what we have seen now, and I think this is something also from having interactions with people around the world, we are already being seen differently. There has been a momentous change in how the European Union is perceived. And at the moment, by and large, that is a positive change. They are seeing the union being effective. They're seeing the union taking on responsibility. If we fail in this, I think what we are condemning the European Union to is in the long-term irrelevancy. And that, by that, I mean not just the institution, I mean all of us individual member states as well.
Thank you very much. That is all we have time for, but we will be coming back on these issues at our next update, which will immediately follow the regular European Council later this month. Lots of open questions. And as you've both said, a lot can happen between today and then over the coming days. So we will return to all these topics. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you all for joining us at this very critical moment for the EU, this very terrifying, frankly, moment for all of us. I can only wish you all the best weekend you can have under the circumstances, but thank you very much indeed, and do take care. Goodbye.